So Eve, why don't you talk a little bit longer so people can come in?
Okay.
Right.
Can people see the flyer?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So should we start letting people in? Are you
Yeah.
ready?
Is that okay with you, Eve?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, Ron, you just give me the signal and I'll go, okay?
Okay. You may just want to tell people we're just waiting for other people to come in, okay?
Okay.
Meredith, will we be able to see the audience?
Yeah, you will be able to see the audience.
When I go to view, it doesn't show me that.
It's hard to, if somebody has screen sharing on, then you can't see it all, but
Okay.
yeah.
Hello, everybody. This is Ana Vincenti with Nos Quedamos. Hi, Ron. No
Hi.
hugs and kisses. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. We're waiting for a couple of other folks to come in.
Yes, I know. But it's so nice to see all of you.
Oh, okay.
What am I, chopped liver? I don't get one?
Of course you do. Where are you? Where are you, sweetheart? I don't see.
I'm somewhere in these Brady Bunch boxes. How are you, Anna Love? Mwah, mwah, mwah. How are you?
Oh, I love you, Weddy. You know, I know you're from Toity Toit and Toit, but you don't love the Bronx anymore.
You know, I love this. I'm all the way in Cleveland. And I miss New York so much.
By the way, I was right near Nos Quedamos yesterday. I got my last vaccine shot.
Really? Where did you go? To the Yankee Stadium?
No, to 701 St. Anne's Avenue, right in your turf.
Oh, wow. How nice.
Yeah. If we weren't so restricted, I would have stopped by.
Oh, well, you're right. Well, we're only there on Wednesdays, Ron.
Okay.
Buena vida.
Well, darling, that's because we're there to feed the people. Hello.
Yo, the people only eat once a week? That sounds like a Reagan budget proposal. ¿Qué pasó?
Listen, it's a whole box full of a lot of goodies, so it lasts them more than a week.
I hear that ketchup is a vegetable, so we can make that work.
Oh, isn't that what Bush said?
For everybody entering the waiting room,
Reagan.
this is an informal chat. You are at the lecture series.
This is the opening presentation.
It's great seeing you, Anna. Now we see you.
Oh,
Can
okay.
you make me co-host again? This is the virtual equivalent of giving each other hugs.
Yes.
Sorry, who said that?
Meredith, that way I can just help you. When I made you host it, it took my co-hosting away.
There are now 47 participants, but we have a considerable number more that are registering. So let's wait about 3 or 4 minutes before we start. And then, but I know it's a Friday evening and I don't want to keep everybody too late. So let's start at 20 of, okay?
Okie dokie.
Artichoke.
And I just approved a couple more people. So they should have their links. Okay.
These are the real diehards as opposed to the folks who come to the series every year coming for the wine and cheese.
I was just
I
thinking
asked
of
you
him
if she
going
could
to
provide
get
it, but she
one.
wasn't ready to fax it to everybody.
But you don't have your own wine and cheese where you are?
No.
At the beach, I'm waiting for the Cabana guys. They're not serving today.
Eddie, it's Ray. It's good to see you, and thank you so much for helping me get on.
Ray, you were so popular. We were all named Ray Figueroa at the beginning of this call. You should know that.
Oh my God, Ray is on this call too. Ray, I see you every day now. Mamma mia. People are going to start talking about us. Even though it's virtually.
Yes,
Oh my God, people are gonna think we're crazy. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not crazy. It's just that we love each other so much that we can't help ourselves.
Okay.
It's in our blood.
Two things could be true at once, Anna.
Touche. Yes, yes.
Me and Mrs. Jones.
Okay.
You got to throw that bass in there, Ray. You know. Yeah, Mrs.
For those in the waiting room, we'll get started in 3 minutes.
Oh, and Ellie claims she's getting on also. So you're gonna be able to see Ellie.
Oh man, the Nos Quedamos crew. It's going to be one of those lecture series. It's a
Yeah.
party now. Yes.
Right on. We're gonna party.
Mm.
People from the South Bronx know how to do this. Hello.
That was the name of.
I don't know about toity and toy, but okay.
That's actually the name of the 4th panel in this lecture series. The South Bronx knows how to do this. So,
Okay.
So, Professor Schiffman, we have over 50 people. Do you think we should get started?
Wow.
Why don't you start?
Okay, great. I will do that. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the GCPE Spring Lecture Series. I'm going to make you endure a brief message from our sponsor before we get to the more interesting parts of the evening. My name is Eve Barron. I'm the chair of the Pratt Institute's Graduate Center for Planning and Environment. And for those of you who don't know, the GCPE is an interdisciplinary department made up of 4 related programs in historic preservation, sustainable environmental systems, urban placemaking and management, and city and regional planning. We have deep roots in the community development world, and we are practice oriented. We teach participatory process as the best way to support and advocate for just sustainable neighborhoods and communities. This type of interdisciplinary collaboration is essential to addressing urban challenges, and that's what we try to teach our students. So the Spring Lecture Series is representative of this type of interdisciplinary collaborative dialogue. Each spring we bring together, well, with the exception of last year, we got interrupted by COVID, but we bring together cross sections of people that include community organizers, policymakers, technical experts, decision makers, labor leaders, advocates, who together unpack the issues and bring forward solutions to address today's urban challenges. And tonight's panel kicks off the series. The series is called, as you can see, An Equitable Recovery Agenda for New York. And no doubt, one of the most pressing challenges in generations. We're pleased to once again partner with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance to curate and moderate these panels. And tonight, we're also grateful for the co-sponsorship of the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University. So tonight's distinguished panelists are going to be moderated by Ron Schiffman and Eddie Bautista, certainly distinguished in their own rights. Ron, you might know, co-founded the Pratt Institute Center for Community and Environmental Development, which is today the oldest continuously operated university-based community design and development center in the US. He participated in the creation of the country's first community development corporation, Bed-Stuy Restoration. He served on the New York City Planning Commission from 1990 to 96. He's an award-winning planner and community development specialist and a lifelong civil rights advocate. And we are proud that he is Professor Emeritus in the department. Eddie Bautista is the executive director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and that's a citywide network of community-based organizations of color advocating for the empowerment of environmentally overburdened neighborhoods. Think of just about any equity generating environmental advancement, and Eddie's had a hand in it. The Brownfield Opportunity Area Program, the Solid Waste Management Plan, organizing the People's Climate March, helping pass the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. The list goes on for a long, long time. And we're also proud to claim Eddie among our city and regional planning alumni. So Eddie, I'm going to turn it over to you to get the ball rolling tonight.
Sure. Thanks, Eve. Welcome, everyone. I've been trying to think about how long we've been doing this collaboration between the Alliance and the Graduate Center at Pratt. I think it's going on like 9 or 10 years now. It's been going on for a while. And I noticed that there's some, I noticed a few regulars. So thank you all for joining us, even though we don't have the wine and cheese tonight. We appreciate you, we see you. And those of you who are regulars probably remember about, maybe 4 years ago, the series took a turn. I remember the first lecture series was about 4 years ago. When it took that turn, it was like, my God, can you believe he got elected? That was the name of the series. Then the following year, it was, my God, do you believe he actually tried that this year? And then the third year was, what do we have to do to get this man impeached? And then COVID hit last year. And so here we are with a fresh start. Just so you know, all of those series culminated in the departure of the Trump administration. I'm just kidding, folks. But thank you all for joining us tonight. As always, I'm proud to be joined by Ron Schiffman, my longtime partner in crime. You guys heard some of his many accomplishments. The one that Eve didn't say is he was also voted the city planning commissioner most likely to talk about the stock transfer tax. If we don't talk about it tonight, I'll be shocked if Ron does not bring up the stock transfer tax. In fact, I'm going to give him the opportunity to do that right now. Ron Schiffman, take it away, my friend.
Okay, thank you very much, Eddie, and thanks, Eve. And I'm thanking everybody who's showing up tonight. It's really a real honor to have you here and begin to talk about what I think is really a critical issue. You know, the idea of this forum, and I'm not going to talk about the stock transfer tax, not yet. The idea of the forum was really based on the realization that we are at a really major turning point. Obviously, there's the intersection of the pandemic with historic injustices, a great economic recession, which is to a great extent falling on the shoulders and the families of the BIPOC community throughout the city of New York. It's everybody we applaud at 7 o'clock, will be forgotten, we're afraid, in the future unless we develop a set of economic development programs that really address the frontline workers, the people from the caring community, and those that really have pulled us through this pandemic. And at the same time, this year has been a very eventful one. Really, the emergence of the realization that we need a racial reckoning in this country. And we have this intersection between economic development because of the economic recession. We have this issue of addressing racial and economic injustices and huge disparities. And what we really need to do is look at how we could make sure that we don't go back to the old normal, that we develop a new normal, one that really develops economic and political systems that are not tilted to the status quo. And so how do we really animate organizers and activists and policymakers and professionals to seize the moment to ensure that recovery efforts do not return to the old normal, but that we finally begin to address the interconnected issues of racial, economic injustice, disparities in income, and wealth and exclusionary practices. At Pratt, we've tried right from the very beginning to deal with some of these issues using different language at times. I found a piece earlier this morning from 1989 where Susan Motley and I wrote about the need for a comprehensive and integrated strategy addressing social, economic, and political and civil rights issues. And that, I think, had an impact on the community development movement. But we're at a new moment now in 2021, and one that, we have a new administration in Washington. A few months from now, we will begin to make the decision as to who will be the new administration in the city of New York. And New York often was a leader by its innovation, and some of the programs that were in New York rippled throughout the nation. And we need to seize this moment to begin to think through what are those efforts that we want to focus on and how do we really want to deal with that. And so we've pulled together some really important people today. And we're starting late and I've been talking a little bit too long. I'm not going to read their full resumes. You should all have received them with your today. And I suggest you read them at your leisure, but understand the importance of every person who's on the panel. And we're going to begin today's with Roland V. Englund, who is the Dean of the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs. And as Eve said, they graciously co-sponsored this event with us today. Roland, I'm not going to call him Dean Englund, I know him as a friend from the time he was in New York, is recognized for his scholarly and applied work in the area of economic and community development. He was a program officer at the Ford Foundation when I met him. He then moved to Newark and worked there as an academic, has consulted with community-based groups throughout the country, and has a real understanding of the history of community development. And what I really wanted him to do was to sort of set the table today, because as I mentioned, we're at this moment. But what can we learn from past efforts? Because to a great extent, the community development movement that emerged was emerging at the time where economic disparities, where the civil rights movement was moving full steam ahead, where we had a young president who declared a war on poverty. And now we have to add to that the pandemic and the challenges of climate change. And all of these things are intersecting. And we didn't have the word intersectionality when in the 60s. If we did, we probably would have used it. So what I'd like to ask Roland to start with here is to really talk a little bit about what the community development movement can teach us as we move ahead into the future and as we get into this discussion. So Roland, without any more talking, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I hope this works seamlessly.
Well, thank you, Ron. I really appreciate that introduction and the opportunity to talk to you tonight. I'd like to thank the Pratt Institute, specifically Chair Eve Barron, Professors Ron Schiffman and Edward Batista for organizing this forum, an equitable recovery agenda for New York. Ron Schiffman and Pratt have a special place in my heart. First of all, I grew up in the neighborhood surrounding Pratt and still have fond memories of attending various events on the campus, including a summer enrichment program nearly 55 years ago. Regarding Ron was already a legend in the community and economic development field some 30 years ago when he helped a newly hired program officer at the Ford Foundation understand the rare opportunity that he was given. Ron spent much time helping me understand the history and the logic of the field. I appreciated his unsentimental view that while CED had accomplished much, its potential rested on growing and changing while staying close to its founding values of economic self-determination, coupled with the pursuit of community power and influence for ordinary citizens, especially citizens on the margins. In truth, this is my departure for this forum. I'm going to talk in broad strokes about a body of work that I feel is important to an equitable recovery agenda for New York, and indeed, many other efforts at economic and social justice. And that body of work is community and economic development. I often hear in some circles that CED is old hat. Community and economic development still matters, but we have to ask reasonable but tough questions about the field and its ability to play a role in economic and social justice. We have made some headway in this country on creating an infrastructure over the last 50 years to address neighborhood and people poverty that is second to none. The community development corporations and other neighborhood-based groups that build housing, train adults and youth, support small businesses, promote environmental justice, do yeoman's work, and they need more recognition and support. The fact they do this work despite significant challenges, including globalization, the changing nature of the problem or poverty, a lack of an articulated coordinated support system and scale, makes their work even that much more admirable. Before I go further, let me mention a little bit about the pandemic. The pandemic is upending all manner of things in our society: work, health, family, and community. But economic and workforce fragility were pressing issues even before COVID-19. There is a rich body of work showing that our evolving economy is leaving many working class Americans with less than ideal work opportunities, with a burgeoning lower wage workforce to show for it. Poverty, while decreasing over the years, has become concentrated and racialized and stretches way beyond inner city neighborhoods. Now town, suburb, and countryside suffer similar aspects of concentrated poverty. Some of those things are growing crime rates, significant youth unemployment, environmental degradation, substance abuse, physical blight, and lower higher educational attainment rates. What does this mean for an equitable recovery agenda for New York, indeed the nation? The first thing to note is that I am not saying that community and economic development is the centerpiece for achieving equitable economic and social justice, but it is a key piece. For it to be a key piece, it has to overcome or manage the challenges encompassing the field today. I mentioned earlier globalization. With globalization, the CED field has to recognize that communities are increasingly measured by what tradable goods they possess. Now, tradable goods is a term of art. And whether that be goods or services or human talent, tradable goods, you hear that a lot in the literature. This is a different conception of a community than the one I grew up with. The goal then was to eliminate blight, fix up housing, support small businesses and workforce development in ways that helped neighborhood residents live in a place that promoted health, opportunity, and community. While that goal has not disappeared, globalization has increased competition at the micro neighborhood level, making the focus on human and community development more a conversation about consumption and production. There are good parts and bad parts to the contemporary conversation that ensues about globalization and community economic development. For example, the conversation about post-secondary education as one way to address poverty is an important one and one in which I am engaged and support. But I'm not unaware that the underlying argument says that poverty can be addressed by enhancing human capital. It is not wrong, but it's more complicated than a simple nostrum. Now, I also mentioned the changing nature of the problem. Community and economic development's core values are economic self-determination and building community voice. These intertwined values are needed more than ever to address concentrated, racialized poverty. But public policy, while public policy does support some level of economic self-determination, very little help is given to help communities organize themselves to effectuate voice. There is a pervasive attitude about community organizing that has dominated our conversation for the last 40 years, that we have been there and done that. There is a feeling that communities over-organize themselves with negative consequences in the 60s and 70s. But quite frankly, if you look at the range of successful community-based organizations across the country, they all infuse some variant of community organizing in their work. The problem is they have to stitch it together through their housing development or the episodic enlightened federal policy that actually supports community organizing until it goes out of vogue at the national level. This brings me to rationalizing public support, the public support system for the field. There is no doubt that community-based nonprofit, the community has grown in stature and impact in civic governance. But there is a piecemeal feeling to how these organizations secure support, and it limits their ability to do forward planning and react to changing circumstance. I know that some would argue that rather than look at the support side, we need to look at the availability side. In other words, there are too many organizations competing for the pie. It's a reasonable conversation to have. But before that, we need to rationalize support for those who are doing good and excellent work. It's happening in some places. Many states and cities have annual appropriations for community and economic development and the organizations that do the hard lift. And this is exclusive of the CDBG or the Community Development Block Grant. We should learn from these efforts and build a better system of support. My last point is about scale as a challenge. Community-based development organizations are never going to scale up to solve the problems of economic injustice and racial injustice. They don't need to. They need to have the capacity to organize key sectors to act collectively on local and community economic development, climate change, workforce development, and now education reform. Some of you might liken this or remember this called community planning or comprehensive community development. Now the popular phrase is collective impact. I'll go with the flow. Many communities are using collective impact as a framework for action, and many communities have adopted it as a base for addressing education reform, juvenile justice reform, and workforce development. Now, collective impact encompasses a great deal, and I'll boil it down. At base, it's a data and measurement-driven approach to tackling policy challenges. One of the better known versions of this approach is Strive in Cincinnati, which was launched in 2006. Institutional and community leaders in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky lamented the limited results from fragmented efforts to boost student achievement. They recognized they needed to improve educational outcomes, not only as a civic obligation, but to make their region competitive. Higher education leaders, business leaders, local governments, and nonprofit leaders all agreed to work on improving educational outcomes from cradle to career. More than 300 organizations that affect student achievement participate in Strive, and it's probably more at this point. The partners set targets for different portions of the pipeline and define data needs to measure the flow in the pipeline based on accountability measures agreed to by the partners. Apart from engaging the three school systems, the Strive Partnership developed strategies for coordinating organizations that provide support services to youth and families in the pipeline. So the overall thrust of the effort rests not only on accountability measures, but on accountability-based strategies for building a coordinating system to assist the children and families who pass through. I want to be clear. I use Strive as an example of a network focused on one aspect of economic inclusion and poverty reduction. It is not the only way or the one way to build a governance network, but build these networks we must. We have to focus on network building. The chosen issue, whether it be juvenile justice reform, reducing youth unemployment, economic development, is all part of the same mosaic. After addressing one piece of that mosaic, you will find the need to address another piece. The good thing is that as you address each piece, you build network capacity. So this, after all, is the goal: building local capacity at scale to act on big challenges. Let me close by saying thank you for taking time to attend this event. It's an important topic, and I look forward to hearing my colleagues who are the real experts in discussing an equitable recovery agenda for New York.
Thank you, Roland. I just want to point out to folks, we're going to spend a few minutes hearing from each of the panelists, and I hope to engage them in a discussion. And then feel free to put questions into the chat, and we'll try to get to some of them so we can engage the audience in this discussion as well. we went from Roland, and Roland is much younger than I am, but he is a little bit older than the next speaker. And I think it's appropriate that we go probably to the youngest speaker on the panel at this moment. Emily Miles is the Chief Policy and Program Officer of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, now known as FPWA, except I can't pronounce that. And it's an anti-poverty, policy, and advocacy nonprofit with a membership network of nearly 200 human service and faith-based organizations. There she oversees the development and implementation of programmatic policy initiatives that seek to reduce poverty and promote upward economic mobility for all New Yorkers. There's a longer bio in your emails, but having said all that, let me turn it over to Emily. And Emily, do you need to the screen, or are you just speaking?
I'm speaking. I'm going to share a slide a little bit later, but
Okay.
I can share the screen then.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me this evening. This is an honor to be on a panel with such distinguished speakers. So I just had to say that at the beginning. So yes, my name is Emily Miles. I'm representing FPWA tonight. And again, our work focuses on combating income inequality and promoting affordability at the city, state, and national levels. Unfortunately, one doesn't have to look very far in our nation's history to see that disasters, natural or otherwise, always harm low-income communities, communities of color, and immigrant communities the most. And COVID was no different. In addition to increased harms of the actual virus, the economic fallout caused immediate and sustained financial hardship to Black, Latinx, and Native persons. And to make matters worse, federal aid that was supposed to soften those impacts was rolled out in an uneven and inequitable manner, with Black and Latinx households being 8 and 11 percentage points more likely to have delays in receiving relief checks. And this was especially true for the unbanked. So while households across income and racial lines felt the impact of job loss and increased financial hardship, lowest income communities are not seeing jobs rebound in the way we are seeing for other income brackets, largely due to the types of jobs held by these communities, including retail, hospitality, and service positions, which are also the same positions that put many of these people at increased risk for contracting the disease in the first place. And of course, we know what is at the heart of this uneven impact and recovery, and that is the racism and inequality that is embedded in the very fabric of the institutions and systems that we rely on at times like this. As has been said previously, COVID didn't cause this inequality, but it did shine a spotlight on broken and ineffective racist systems that are inclusive of our healthcare system, criminal justice system, workforce and education systems. And then one other system that I'm going to talk a little bit more about tonight, which is our social safety net system, which we at FPWA feel is critical to address if we're going to actually make strides in tackling poverty and economic inequity in our communities. So when we talk about safety net, the American social safety net provides financial, nutritional, work, and other critical supports for millions of low-income families. I'm talking about programs like SNAP, TANF, WIC, Medicaid, child care vouchers, tax credits, and other programs that we've cobbled together as a means of responding to those living in poverty or are facing economic hardship. Prior to the COVID pandemic, the US economy experienced steady growth and record low unemployment, but this economic prosperity was not shared equally, and with especially communities of color feeling the impact of stagnation of wages and skyrocketing costs of basic needs like food, housing, and healthcare. This is where the social safety net should play a role in reducing hardships and safeguarding the most basic needs of economically vulnerable families. This role and the need for safety net provisions has swelled in the wake of the COVID-19 across the nation, but is particularly important for New York State, which was hit hard by the devastating impacts of the pandemic. Unfortunately, though, these decades of underinvestment, patchwork policymaking, and efforts to restrict access to safety net has resulted in myriad issues which undermine the effectiveness and the reach of social supports. So as a result, We have a safety net that excludes many of those who actually need help the most. It doesn't provide support at a monetary value that allows for individuals to meet basic needs, and it disincentivizes continued education and career advancement. One of the reasons why we're so excited about this panel tonight is that now is the perfect time to reimagine this system. And at the heart of that conversation is us reassessing our assumptions as a society that we make about those in poverty. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in policy creation, especially at the national level right now, is a push to expand eligibility or increase the value of these programs, but not enough conversation about what it will actually take to bring about real and lasting change for these low-income families. We need to rethink the impact we are hoping to get out of our anti-poverty policies. What are we actually hoping to achieve? Are we simply moving individuals and families across an arbitrary poverty line, or are we hoping to make a long-term impact in their ability to meet their basic needs? Our current anti-poverty programs are anchored around the federal poverty guidelines, which are inadequate as a measure of poverty and not a true indicator of what it actually costs to live in communities. So just for a reference point, for a single household, the federal poverty guideline is just under $16,000 a year. For a 3-person household, it's just over $27,000 a year, which all of us know from New York is not anywhere near adequate to actually live in this city, but honestly, nowhere in the country. To the credit of the government, even they know this is an inadequate level of income, and most program eligibilities is actually grounded in percentages of those guidelines. So like 200% of the poverty guideline. But those levels are still too low to meet basic needs. At FPWA, we ground our work in the self-sufficiency standard, which is a measure of how much income a family of a certain composition in a certain place needs to adequately meet their basic needs. And so basic needs we define as housing, childcare, food, transportation, healthcare, and emergency savings, along with a couple of other pieces. In many places, this self-sufficiency standard is 2 or 3 times the size of the poverty guidelines and speaks to the true cost of living in our communities and the affordability crisis that we're currently having across this country and in this city. What we see when we analyze wages, and this is where I'm going to quickly share a slide. What we see, hopefully you can see that slide. What we see when we look at the New York's largest occupations across the state, that wages are too low to support a family, even at minimally adequate levels, even sometimes with 2 workers in the household. So here you see on this slide, the New York's 10 largest occupations as compared with the self-sufficiency standard. And what you'll see, we're comparing it to 2 areas in the state, a lower cost area, which is Albany County in upstate, and then a higher cost area in South Manhattan. So the self-sufficiency wage for both of those places, so for Albany County is $31 an hour. But what you see for all but 2 of the most popular occupations in Albany County, those hourly wages are far below what it actually takes to live in that community. In Southern Manhattan, all but 1 occupation is below the self-sufficiency standard. And actually a majority of those occupations are actually less than half of the standard. And so what that means then, I'm gonna stop sharing and go back to just talking to you. What that means then is that the difference between what is actually being earned and that self-sufficiency wage is where the social safety net should step in. Those occupations that you saw listed there, like fast food and counter workers, cashiers, waiters, and waitresses, should sound familiar because those are the same occupations that we relied on as essential workers, but the exact same occupations that are largely populated by people of color and earning substandard wages. So again, this is where the social safety net should step in and provide support. But even when we stack these programs on top of each other, even when we combine childcare support, housing support, and food support, those supports are not enough to make up the gap between wages earned and what actually takes to live in our communities. And unfortunately, many of the proposals we see in front of Congress right now that are included in the American Rescue Plan, they are largely making tweaks to existing programs that for many aren't going far enough to actually affect long-term affordability. But one additional point I'll make is that when we look at factors that make communities of color especially vulnerable to the economic fallout of the pandemic, one large factor of that is the lack of wealth accumulation in communities of color. This can be attributed to a number of factors, many stemming from policies that purposely excluded communities of color from wealth building opportunities. But the impact extends today, because if you're a family that's earning half of what it takes to actually live in your community, there is no opportunity to save earnings to insulate you from emergency costs related to job loss, health problems, the birth of a new child, or a global pandemic. And without the ability to build savings and wealth, individuals and families lack the ability to build appropriate capital to change the long-term financial position of themselves and their family, making it difficult to do things like purchase a home, start a business, or afford higher education. So now is the time for us to rethink the social safety net system and what it's actually going to cost to tweak things like the child care tax credit and other programs that actually allow for the affordability in neighborhoods, so that our communities in New York City, New York State, and nationally can have opportunities to build wealth to pass on to not just their immediate family members, but generations ahead of them. And I will turn it back over to Ron.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll get to some questions to you and to Roland in a few more minutes, but let's now move over to Kathy Albisa, Kathy is the co-founder and former executive director of Partners for Dignity and Rights, known as NESRI, a social movement organization that supports community groups across the country in their campaigns for structural change. In many ways, you're really following Kathy, with the gauntlet that Emily put down as how do we really achieve some of the goals that she's been articulating in her presentation. Kathy and I have been on boards together, and I must say you're in for a treat. And she was here, I think, 2 years ago. And so, Kathy, why don't you take the forum, the podium.
Thank you, Ron. First, I will deny being an expert as we were described, but I have had the opportunity to work with some brilliant people in community that have been trying to answer Emily's question, right? How do we re-envision ourselves going forward? Because our systems are consistently failing us. And today, I am the former executive director of Partners for Dignity Rights. And today I'm at an organization called Race Forward that works on dismantling structural racism. Partners for Dignity and Rights advocates for economic and social rights. I feel like even though we talk about our work differently in those two organizations, we are literally talking about the same thing, because the denial of economic and social rights in this country has this deeply racialized history. So before I launch though, I wanted to thank you, Ron, for not only having me in this conversation, but for having these conversations, for continuously setting up these conversations. And I think sometimes we lose sight of how important they are. I know I do. I wanted to ask for people to let me know in the chat, how many of you have had discouraging moments when you think, I don't want to have conversations anymore. I just want to see the change. Or had a moment of loss of faith where you wonder, is any of this ever going to change? Have any of the 74 people in the virtual room felt that way? Well, not seeing your answers, but I think, well, yes, definitely from Alexandra. And I bet you're not the only one. Lots of big yeses, right? because it seems that no matter how bad things get, we keep going down this destructive path. So I just wanted to share that I keep this postcard on my refrigerator from a launch of a project that I'm going to talk about tonight from my former organization. It's called the New Social Contract. And it's grounded in a belief that solutions are already out there, that we have the solutions to these problems, and that they've been driven, the development of them, the ideation, the creativity behind them has been driven by impacted communities, working with many allies, of course, but really driven by impacted communities. And that the solutions aren't just piecemeal, that if you look at them, they add up to a new structure and a new system. I'm gonna see if I drop this project in the link in case anyone is interested and wants to read about it. So I'm leaving it all for you there. But the postcard, back to my postcard, has a quote from one of my mentors who we honored in the launch because we had lost him, Michael Ratner, who had been associated with the Center for Constitutional Rights. And his quote was, "When change comes, it's unpredictable, but it doesn't happen by chance." When Georgia became a politically contested state, it wasn't by chance, right? It was the more than decade-long work that Stacey Abrams and others had done. And when we put new systems in place, it won't be by chance. It'll be because of conversations like this that filter out into the world. And it'll be because of the work that so many of the people in this virtual room do in support of communities coming up with these innovative solutions. In fact, I think that is where we demonstrate what's politically possible. Because you cannot go someplace that we have not imagined in our minds. If we can't imagine it, we cannot do it. So our political imagination is one of the most powerful tools we have to create change. And I really wanted to start by reminding us of that, because we have this moment where we have to think big, where we have to expand our political imagination. We know that structural racism is the glue that holds together the systems here today in the United States. We have racialized tiers in almost everything: housing, jobs, healthcare, education. And that glue has been binding us for centuries. So we have to think big, and we have to think with a very powerful political imagination to start releasing ourselves, liberating ourselves from that. The New Social Contract Project argues that we need both a new form of economy and a new form of governance for the 21st century, and that those things are inextricably intertwined. We've spent the last couple of decades hearing about public-private partnerships, which, if you stop for a minute to think about it, what do they mean by private? When they say private partnerships, let me know in the chat, what do we think they mean by private? Do they mean you and me? We're private citizens. What do they mean? I'll give you a second, if not all. That's right, Caitlin. They mean corporate. Private means corporate, and we have been governed by public corporate partnerships. And those have pretty much defined our economy because they define our governance, and they keep these racialized outcomes in place. They undermine multiracial democracy and democratic practice. And if we don't build a multiracial democracy, we will not have one at all, as recent events, I would say, have demonstrated. So what is this? What are the ideas, the new? What is the new that communities have been piloting now for years? Well, I see them as public community partnerships. Why should the public not be partnering with community rather than partnering with corporations? Those are everything from new calls for a caring economy shaped around income and risk solidarity, in a 21st century community-driven approach to governance and economy. Healthcare is a human right that we publicly finance, childcare, elder care, decent jobs are guaranteed through a federal jobs guarantee, and cooperative work is increasingly common. Community is embedded in local governance through community land trusts, restorative justice model, participatory budgeting. Many of you have heard of these models. How many of you have heard about any of these models? You can give me a yes or no in the chat. But right now they're small. They're small in the face of a much larger and very rapacious economy and form of government. But although they're small, they've been proven to work. They're proven solutions. And if we can imagine shaping our larger world around them, we could transform it. So what opportunities do we have? Because we have a lot of problems. So we have to really start finding some opportunity. How do we get beyond our history? First, we have to be conscious of it. I know that most of you already know we have a deeply racialized history. Just looking at housing as an example. I know that most of you, how many of you know, or if you did know, that when we started the New Deal and we gave mortgages to mostly white families, it was in the regulations, the federal regulations, that you could not get a, quote, demographically inappropriate mortgage. Give me a yes or a no whether you knew that. Yep, most of you know. You're a very well-informed audience. You would be surprised how many people don't know that, right? So you need to continue to spread the word. Or that Puerto Rican communities were 500% more likely to be displaced than white communities for infrastructure projects. And that communities of color were given public housing as a consolation prize. And now 250,000 plus units have been demolished. We also know that not even our mortgage system with the deregulation of finance is working, with the boom and bust that we've been seeing. And now what do we have? We have a foreclosure, an eviction cliff around the corner that might affect 30 to 40 million people at the risk of eviction. For all the reasons that Emily pointed out, there's no reserve, no resiliency. People are living week to week, barely making it. Ron, did you want to? Oh no, I thought you were going to say something. Because people have not been able to build wealth and security. Both renters and homeowners are at risk in this system, but in our city, 1 in 4 renters are severely rent burdened. You all probably know this. That means more than half of their income. 44% are rent burdened. That means 30% of their income. Homeowners, 20% are mortgage burdened. So you can already see the difference in that history of allowing white people to accumulate wealth and depriving communities of color, how it's creating different outcomes in this moment of risk. So what is the federal government looking at? And I'm going to loop back to New York in a minute. What is the federal government looking at as an emergency measure? The solution being proposed is universal vouchers. Can someone in the chat describe a voucher for me? What's a voucher? You guys are very well informed, so I know you know what a voucher is. It's a subsidy. Is it a home? No, it's a piece of paper. It's a piece of paper that guarantees that the landlord is paid. It's not a piece of paper that guarantees permanent and stable housing for the family. It's a piece of paper that guarantees the landlord gets money. Now, in a moment of emergency, given that this is the way our system is organized, it may be a very reasonable emergency measure. But if we're going to have all this money system to keep people off the streets, into a system that has produced tremendous inequities, into a system that's going to further concentrate wealth in the hands of landlords through these vouchers, what can we do to start shifting those resources in a different direction? Because the guarantee is flowing towards the people who are already safe. And that makes absolutely no sense. I mean, what do we know about how vouchers have worked? We know that voucher holders face what they call source of income discrimination on a regular basis. We know they face so much source of income discrimination that they've had to pass laws all over the country to prevent it. And we know that those laws are incredibly difficult to actually enforce. We know that they're pushed into areas of concentrated poverty with bad schools, no good hospitals, food deserts. You're community development people, you know how that works. We know that they're disrespected by landlords and that they're disproportionately displaced when the neighborhoods they're living in starts to improve. So yeah, we know vouchers are better than nothing, but they don't change the system. So if we're going to demand a new social contract, how do we democratize resources and power? Because that's what we need to make happen if we want to see that kind of change. So some of the things in the new social contract project that we lift up is rethinking the way we look at land and housing. Why not community control? Why not community ownership? Why not models? It's not the only one. Why not different shared equity models? The one I'll talk about is community land trust. How many people here are familiar with community land trust? Give me a little bit of like heads up here. Is anyone not familiar? Oh my God, you're such an easy group of people to talk to. You know everything. That's another thing people don't even know about. Oh, that's okay, Lynn. That's why we're here, right? We're learning together. But community land trust is basically, a model where a community organization owns the land and families own the homes so they can build equity. And when the foreclosure crisis hit, it had the lowest foreclosure rate of any form of housing. Our 200 community land trusts across the country had the lowest foreclosure rate. Why? Because a community organization was there to support them if they lost their job, because they weren't over leveraged, because it was permanently affordable housing, because we had each other if you were in one of those land trusts. Now they're really hard to scale up. By the way, for those who didn't know, they come out of the civil rights movement. The very first one was for Black farmers in Georgia. They're very hard to scale up because there are financial barriers, land is expensive. But what if we were to redirect some of these emergency resources into trying to scale up models like those? What if we were to allow voucher holders to pool their money and we created containers like community land trusts or other forms of shared equity for them to start building equity, the equity that their ancestors were so unjustly, that their families historically were so unjustly excluded from. And they're not perfect. One of the biggest challenges with community land trusts is governance. A lot of times they fail because the governance is a struggle. But that's not specific to CLTs or poor people. Any co-op board in New York City has its stories, as we have heard. This happens to anyone that tries a collective effort. On the other hand, why do we focus so intently on the failures of a model with so much potential and not think about all the failures the market has brought up? A community land trust model, local democracy, shared ownership, it's hard. But we are better together than we are alone because then we know the market has and will fail us. And as they say, to expect a different result, to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, some people would say is stupid, other people would say crazy, but in any case, it's not a very good idea. And there are ways to finance these new models. Not only should we get our local leaders to push the federal government to give us more flexibility, to play with different ideas, but places like Baltimore have imposed a transfer tax on high-end real estate sales to fund permanently affordable housing, which is a beautiful idea. You tax speculation to build models that are not speculative. And there is historical precedent for big changes. If you look at the 1930s, the 900 mostly rural cooperatively owned utilities that emerged out of the New Deal now serve more than 40 million people. They span 47 states, and 90% of them are in high poverty counties. 1 in 10 families had electricity in 1936, so 9 out of 10 did not. Less than 20 years later, most people did. Where did we fall short? We didn't build those type of cooperatives in a racially equitable way, and we didn't build them in a climate conscious way. We have an opportunity to do it right. We have an opportunity in this moment of crisis to make different kinds of demands, but we have to get bold. I was reading a history about, I know the Bronx is in the house because I heard you earlier. Everyone heard you earlier. The Bronx is definitely in the house. And in the 1930s, I was reading about a rent strike in the Bronx, where 4,000 people came out to support the rent strikers, had a riot with the police, And before it was even over, they cut a deal with the landlord to get a rent reduction and to bring every evicted family back in. We need to get bold. We need to get, as the mayor of Puerto Rico would say, we need to be nasty women sometimes because the times call for it. And we have an opportunity. It requires us to exercise our political imagination, to use our political power. Put those two things together and you have imaginative power. And I'm sure that we have a lot of that in this room. I am not an expert, but I can see from the chat that many of you are. We need your brilliance. We need your expertise. And I thank you for letting me be here with all of you. You're muted and I'm done, Ron. That's a bad combination.
Oh, I don't know why. I'm just saying thank you for that presentation. There are many comments on the chat and questions that address how do we really do what you're saying? How do we move from ideas to reality? But we'll get to that in a while. What I'd like to do is to turn it over now to Sarah. And Sarah Ludwig has, I think, one way of doing it. She's the founder and co-director of the New Economy Project, established in 1995. New Economy Project seeks to build a just economy that works for all, rooted in racial and gender justice, cooperation, and ecological sustainability. For those of you who came in late, for the full bios, please refer to the emails you received earlier today. But why don't we turn it over to Sarah right now?
Great, thanks, Ron, and thanks to the other panelists and to Pratt and to Eddie and to everybody who's here tonight. I really appreciate going after Kathy because she really set an excellent framework talking about the new social contract that aligns really well with the work that we do at New Economy Project. And you heard from Ron our mission, which is really all about vision. It's all about transformational change and understanding that unless we have this vision and that we act boldly, things are not going to get better. And I would just start to say, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the campaigns that we're doing and ground some of what Kathy was talking about in work that's going on right now in New York City, in New York State. And I want to invite everybody to be thinking big and to be thinking bold and to be thinking about unabashed action and real sort of seizing this. Ron said at the beginning, we need to seize the moment. We've just come from, we're in the midst of this pandemic still. We, have had all these years of Trump and Trumpism, and, we have looming climate change. We have, everyone keeps talking about how the pandemic has laid bare racial inequities and injustice. If that's what it took for everybody to see what has been such a just clear and profound set of issues for so many people for so long, I don't know what to say about that, except that this is a moment. This is a moment to seize. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization, how we do what we do, and these movements that are really coalescing around a lot of the models that Kathy was talking about. And I'm really eager to hear what questions and ideas people have. So, we at New Economy Project is a relatively small organization, but we were started 25 years ago. And at the time, the venerable Eddie Bautista was actually on our founding board. So thank you, Eddie, for that. We're still around all these years later. We really had as a point of departure something that still very much rings true for us, which is that, it's very New York City rooted, and it's that neighborhoods don't just happen, but they are shaped. They are shaped within broad structures and systems of power. And these systems of power are predicated on exploitation, on extraction, on exclusion of people of color, of women, of immigrants, and also a false notion that many people have of unlimited physical resources. So Ron was talking at the beginning about various intersections of, thinking about racial and economic justice and neighborhood equity. And we would infuse in that thinking really about ecological sustainability issues. And they all are very inextricable in many ways. And to some extent, when we're talking about one, we're talking about all of them, but we need to be really infusing our discourse with thinking about climate as well. So, so much of what, we think about is that because the system is itself intrinsically inequitable, our task, our job, our vision is not to fix an unjust system. It's not a reformist approach. We have to tinker around the edges and make things better within a system that we know is itself destructive and extractive and exploitative. And so at New Economy Project, what we've been doing for many years with many of you and, many groups around the city and the state and the country is that we fight economic discrimination as it plays out at the neighborhood level, and that serves to perpetuate segregation, inequality, and poverty. And we work with community-based groups to build a new economy that is based on cooperation and neighborhood equity. And what we've seen in this moment, because that's what we're talking about tonight, is this moment that we're in and what the opportunities and possibilities and imperatives are. What we see is something I don't know that we expected last March. I think we organizationally stepped back and we said, our groups that we're working with in coalition around our main campaigns, which are around helping coordinate the community land trust movement in New York City through Nicely. And there are a bunch of Nicely New York City Community Land Initiative partners here tonight. Very happy to see you here. We're also working on city and state public banking campaigns, which is what I'm mostly going to talk about. And we also coordinate a New York State community equity agenda, which is about pushing at the state level a vision for community development, which is about community control, which is about the self-determination that Roland talked about before, which is about community wealth building rather than an extractive model of community development. And we also have a very robust financial justice project in which we're fighting Wall Street companies that are harming New Yorkers. And so when the pandemic hit, what we started being flooded with were calls from all sorts of people across the city who were being basically told that they had to run into court to defend themselves against debt collectors. And Emily, a lot of what you were talking about very much resonates among the people that we work with in our law project, our financial justice work. And we wondered, while we were putting all this energy into helping people ward off these bottom-feeding wealth extractors that target brown and Black people and communities for systematic wealth extraction, which I can talk about in more detail if you want. We thought, well, are these coalitions going to keep going? These are a lot of the coalition members in the work that we do are in frontline communities. We're dealing with really pressing, urgent matters. And we thought, well, we need to just sort of step back and see where things go. And the fact is that groups within very short time made very clear that they are more galvanized than ever to build new institutions, to be bold, to call things what they are, to think about creating democratically structured institutions that are predicated on a very different vision for how we live, how we structure our economy, to be one that is generative, to be one that is not extractive, to be one that is cooperative and collective and so forth. So I'm going to talk for 1 second about one of our campaigns, which is around creating a public bank for New York. So like so much work, and even the framing for this tonight's discussion has been about tending to problems that have existed, way before the pandemic. New York City's operating budget alone, does anybody know how much it is? Anybody want to guess who doesn't already know? I know Councilmember Rosenthal has been a great partner in this work, was on before, I think she still is. What's the city's operating budget? Anybody? Ron, what do you think it is? Yeah, it's something like 80 something billion. It's 90 something billion. Billion. I mean, we can't even fathom it. Where does that money go? Well, all of our public money, all of it by law must go into commercial banks. So there is this very obscure entity in New York, yeah, wow, There's this very obscure 3-person commission called the New York City Banking Commission that decides which banks get our public deposits. Now, it's not like we take $90 billion in our budget and plunk it into the banks, because obviously the money goes in, it goes out, it gets allocated, it's flowing, but it's still a tremendous amount of money. There we go. Thank you, council member. 96.3 billion this year. It's going into the very banks that are not only failing to serve communities, that are not only systematically and have for decades been redlining communities of color. These are not only the same banks that are responsible for the foreclosure crisis and that really toppled our entire economy, but these are the same banks that are fueling climate change, investing in fossil fuels, in private prisons. You know, there are a lot of groups that are very concerned about this because of the role that these same banks play in munitions, in war, and so forth. So why are we as New Yorkers not putting our public money to towards the public good? And that's the concept of a public bank, is that it's our money, that our institutions, that our public money should serve the public good, really fundamental. So meanwhile, we're putting our money in institutions that are not only failing to serve us, but actively harming New Yorkers and the planet. And it's time this has to stop. And so there's a whole movement that's cropped up in New York City, the Public Bank NYC Coalition. I think a few members are on right now. And it's really exciting because on one hand, it's about divestment. We need to get our money out of these Wall Street actors. It's not accountable. I don't need to explain that more. And then it's about investment, which is that we need an accountable public bank that is chartered with a public purpose and that is structured and governed in such a way that it's about social justice, that the money from the bank is then used to support financial justice through supporting community development financial institutions that are community controlled, community-based financial institutions with a social justice mission. These exist. New York City has some of the greatest community development credit unions, which are cooperative financial institutions anywhere in the country. They're wonderful. And they do so much with so little. Imagine if they actually had the public resources that they need. We're talking about worker justice, that to support this very strong, robust movement around worker cooperatives and self-determination over workplace, which again, the council member's been very supportive of, community land trusts and housing and social housing, and then also around climate justice. So those are the sort of 4 pillars of this movement. Climate justice, that's the disinvestment, the divestment piece rather of the move of the public bank being formed and the money coming out of these big corporations, these big Wall Street banks, and then going into community solar, renewable energy, putting this money to use for community environmental projects that are sound and that address climate issues around housing justice, worker justice, and financial justice. So this is very exciting, and there's work, there are bills in the city council, there's work going on at the state level that we're involved in, and budding public banking movements cropping up all over New York right now. And I think that these are examples of the kinds of institutions that Kathy was talking about that are about, you know, they're about vision. These aren't new ideas. Lots of countries have public banking already. People in this country and in New York, they're kind of like, oh, no one's done this. Well, we actually think, great, we can be as creative as we need to be. And we can create these institutions in a way that fulfill this vision of people and planet-centered world that we want to live in. And we don't have time to be doing otherwise. We don't have time to be tinkering around the edges and doing sort of, you know, let's make foreclosures fairer. I mean, this is what the kind of work we did for years. It's kind of, we're fighting the foreclosure crisis and being very clear that it's about racial justice and targeting of communities by Wall Street banks to extract wealth systematically from communities. Yes, that was important, an important work to put a spotlight on that. But, you know, it's very clear that our energies have to go towards really deep work that is about changing a system, not making it fairer or less predatory or more equitable. I've got to say, I've started developing these pet peeves in my 50s around, you know, sort of these mission statements by groups. And we probably did the same thing not that long ago, which is, you know, we need to fight for more equitable, it's like, no, we need equitable. It's not fairer, it's fair. It's not more just, we want justice. So, look forward to hearing the kinds of questions that you have. And we have lots and lots of examples of other institutions that people are looking and working towards and building as we speak that, again, they're not necessarily new models, but they're being understood in a framework of a very different way to organize our lives. And to Ron's stock transfer tax, are you going to talk about it? Because all of this is also about equitable, not just, models, it's about an equitable system. And we've got, in the short term, there's all sorts of stuff New York can and should be doing that will really make a big difference. Right now, we have on the books this stock transfer tax where, a fraction of a few pennies per every share traded on Wall Street is taxed. It actually exists. This law exists. And what does New York do with it? Something like $16 billion it collects through this pennies on each share transfer. It returns it to the investors. We collect it and then we rebate it.
Daily.
So, sorry, Ron, you know more about it than I do, but that's all I need to know to say this is, at the same time that I'm talking about these affirmative, transformational structures and institutions that people are building, we also need to make sure that we have just manifest, really basic equity on the side, on the revenue side. So more to say, but thank you very much.
Here comes Ron, right on cue. Come on, Ron.
Thanks. I just do want to ask you one quick thing before you leave, Sarah. I believe there's one state in the United States that has a public banking system.
Yes, it's North Dakota.
And it is a Republican state, if I remember. It's a red state, right?
It is. So the State Bank of North Dakota was formed in about 100 years ago. And it was, we are in New York actually fighting for what we call municipal public banking, which is a different model from what they have in North Dakota, which is the State Bank of North Dakota. And there are lots of things we can take away from that that are helpful to us. And there are lots of ways in which it's not really relevant to what we're doing. So I have to say that as New Yorkers, when you go into a room and you start talking about the State Bank of North Dakota, people start to look at you like, North Dakota. But you're right, there is a State Bank of North Dakota, and people would say it weathered the foreclosure crisis better than any other bank. They have the strongest local banking network of any state in the whole country. There are more state banks and credit unions in North Dakota than in any per capita than any other state in the country. So there's a very robust aspect to the state banking, the State Bank of North Dakota, that we can draw from as a lesson in New York, but there's lots of things we probably will do pretty differently here. And right now in New York, like I said, we're trying to make sure we have public banking at the city and county and town level. So we're working for local public banking as well.
Yeah.
Thanks for saying that, Ron.
Okay, thank you. Quick question to all the panelists. We've got a lot of ideas on the table. Some of them thinking very big, some of them detailing what can be done on a neighborhood level and sustaining it. Years ago, in the 60s when I got started and followed not too far behind by Roland, the idea behind addressing issues of poverty were to eliminate it. Now, more and more, the discussion is adaptation to it. And what I'm hearing from a number of you is that we need to go big. And I would like to ask each of you, how do you respond to going big? Are you afraid of it? What are the steps that we take to actually go big? For instance, I pulled out while Sarah was talking something in my file that says go big. To rescue America from COVID-19 crisis, we're going to need a lot more than a bailout, by Barry Ritholtz in Bloomberg News, basically going back in his recommendations to a New Deal, not the New Deal that Kathy was talking about, but the old New Deal during the Roosevelt period, which for a variety of reasons had a lot of racist elements to it. So let me open it up, and let's go back first to Roland, because one person asked the question when you were talking about community development corporations, whether or not it wasn't really a neoliberal approach to issues. And I want to know what your reaction to it is.
Well, it's one way of looking at it. I look at CDCs as Tocqueville's children. It's really Wisconsin American political ideology. And yes, that's based on a capitalist understructure, but my question would be, where does it get us to deconstruct whether it's a neoliberal attempt to manage things? I think that the Community Development Corporation is one adaptation to help communities bridge the gap between capacity in this nation and promoting their own interests on a larger stage. The field has done it well, it's done it poorly, it's done it in between. But my sense is that if you didn't have community-based development, you'd have to invent it, because there's just no in between. There's no sort of intermediary between communities that are marginalized and the larger society.
I happen to agree with Roland. I also want to point out that what we're talking about is an invention that came out of the community itself. Basically, efforts in Bedford-Stuyvesant, the project I was involved in, to redress some of the major problems that were facing them. Housing abandonment, yet housing shortages at the same time. Buildings were being abandoned because the owners couldn't get the money to fix them up or pay their taxes. And at the same time, people in need of housing to live in. Some people who had invested were losing their investments in the community. It had to deal with getting jobs and seeing better schools and other issues there. And they came up with an idea about a comprehensive interwoven attempt at regenerating their community, using housing and physical development as an economic engine to drag through other improvements in the community. It was born out of people in the Bedford-Stuyvesant community who reacted to the fact that wherever they went, government turned them down. And they basically said, if government won't help us, we have to create our own institutions that will garner the resources to do it. And a lot of the things we take for granted today, the Community Development Finance Institute, Community Reinvestment Act, a lot of the programs that took place in the city of New York that allowed for community management of buildings, community cooperatives and all of that came because people fought from it. Government didn't give anybody anything. It was reacting to demands that came from organizing efforts similar to the one that Sarah was just talking about, that Eddie has been involved in the environmental justice movement. So we have to look at it, I think, as a building block and something that we really can gain a lot from. But I want to hear from some of the other panelists. And Emily, a lot of what you talked about were really, how do we create a safety net? And that safety net really has been very frayed in our society. And obviously we have to reinstitute it. But how do we also develop the mechanisms to actually lift people out of poverty and take a view that it's a goal for the future? And it's not a critique, it's just a question.
No, I 100% with you, because where I think, I actually in preparing for this talk, I actually Googled purpose of the safety net. Not because I don't know the history behind it, but sometimes it's helpful to get ideas. And the first thing it pulled up is the OSHA website for Canada, their version of it. And they had this whole definition of what a safety net is that what it is that it's a net that doesn't allow a worker to fall too far and protects from injury. But what it also said was A net does not prevent a worker from falling. And that last line really kind of hit me, because our current thinking of a safety net is that it's supposed to kind of catch you. But we recognize in almost every other aspect of the world, healthcare, child welfare, all these other things, that prevention is worth far more than the cure afterwards. But we've given up the idea of preventing poverty. Now we're trying to cure it instead of actually getting to kind of the root causes and stopping someone from falling in the first place. The safety net is a band-aid to try to help people in the moment, because there are always going to be crises, right? And it's really important for us to have that strong safety net in order to keep people from falling too far and to protect them. But we're not willing to invest in the systems then that keep people from falling in the first place. And there are a lot of reasons for that. There's a racism I talked about, and others have talked about earlier, and all of those pieces. But it's also expensive to do some of these programs. FPWA did a report in 2014, I think it was, estimating the cost of lifting all of New York City residents out of poverty. What would it take just to get them across the poverty line, which we know is woefully inadequate? And it was going to cost about $9 billion per year to do that. That's a lot of money, and that's a big idea, but you're going to spend $9 billion anyway. Like, we're going to be spending this money. It comes down to values. It comes down to what we're willing to invest in and what we're willing to do as a society to keep people from getting to that point anyway. And so you said, like, are you afraid of big ideas? No, like, we have to have these big ideas, and there's no shortage of these big ideas that are out there, either from the government intervention side or the community side. You've heard a number of them today. There's no shortage of them. And I think that the sense that what we need to do, and someone just said this in the chat, it's not about a safety net as much as about paying a fair wage for a fair day's work. The federal minimum wage is a disgrace. 100% it is. I absolutely agree. You either need to raise wages or you need to increase affordability. And the safety net can do both of those things if we restructure it to do so. This is not a tweaking moment. This is a flip the table moment and completely restructure how we currently assist people in poverty.
Emily, do you still have access? I'd like to see that chart you showed us a little bit earlier and ask a couple of people a question based on that chart.
Sure, yeah, I'll share my screen.
If you look at the chart, those who can live comfortably in New York are all in general and operations managers. To a great extent, that is the group that was able to work at home. The registered nurses were working, but they were working in danger. So most of the other people have been the ones facing unemployment and all of the various different issues that it may be they may be permanently unemployed. How do we basically deal with the changing nature of how people are employed and how we begin to address issues of economic disparity given that dramatic changes? Is there something we can do that would address those issues? Is it something along the line of a guaranteed second income throughout the country, or something along the lines that Yang is talking about? I'm not talking about the trivial dollars, but really a sufficient income so there's sufficiency for living in South Manhattan, for instance. And so can I ask Emily and Sarah and Kathy to discuss that? Let me throw it to all of you.
Sure. I mean, oh, go ahead.
Again.
I mean, I think the concepts are really interesting, right? I mean, there is a net for some people, and then there's just safety for others, right? When you think about the amount, we talk about it being expensive, but it's actually far less expensive than the number of subsidies we're pumping into sectors and communities that already have quite high levels of wealth, right? I mean, we know we spend 3 times as much on housing subsidies for upper and middle income people than for people that are low income. Then Derek Hamilton did a costing out of a federal jobs guarantee that would guarantee everyone in the country at least a $15 an hour job, which is not enough for New York, but it's a big change from where we are now, would be less than our military budget. It depends what we think of as expensive reflects how much of a priority these things are for us, right? I mean, banks are safe. They don't need a safety net because we keep them safe. We only need a net when we put people in a position that they're going to step through a gap, right? By definition. So I think I agree, we need a net for right now, but a net is like a lawsuit. It's a sign of failure. Something already went wrong. We need to create a system where we don't have the gaps that people fall through.
Sarah or Roland? Any response? Yeah.
I mean,
What
I'm
I-
thinking about some of the things that Kathy's been saying. And so, you know, I think that's really a meaningful framing. And also, you know, we talk about making, you know, sort of addressing these issues of profound poverty. And, you know, what we see at our organization, because of the work that we do, is that we have a system that's also extracting what little money people have. We work with, you know, hundreds and hundreds of people each year, New Yorkers who, you know, are having their wages garnished, are, you know, for years sometimes, are, you know, having all sorts of money taken from their bank accounts, having state tax refunds intercepted. I think I saw one of our staff attorneys is on tonight, and she does this work every single day. So when you have a system that's not about wealth building, but is actually, you know, you've got all these people who are already on that chart that Emily shared with us, who are struggling because they don't have enough money, and money's being taken from them in all sorts of ways, left and right. People who are paying much more for basic necessities. And then you layer on the pandemic and the, you know, hundreds of thousands of lost jobs and all the just, you know, unbelievable pressures around housing and evictions and all of that. So it's not just about income and giving people more money. It's got to be about a much bigger set of changes and about work that is about dignity and work that where, you know, we haven't talked yet about cannabis legalization in our state. And there's lots of talk in that context about trying to augment worker-owned businesses as a matter of social equity. Maybe that'll help light some, you know, spark some other activity in New York to support that kind of structure. I know that when people start hearing about worker co-ops, one of the first things some people think is that question about scale that's come up a couple of times tonight. But I don't think we should be inhibited by saying, well, I mean, you have to start somewhere. And we've seen that when there are resources and technical support, there is a tremendous amount that people can do to augment work and not be, you know, and have say over their work. And again, it's Kathy was saying this before, it's not easy. And there's a lot built in of challenges built in, but it's a much freer, liberated way of doing, thinking about work and material existence.
I just want to point out, we read an article today from Axios. Actually, it came out yesterday, and it describes U.S. job losses by annual income. And those making less than $30,000 a year lost 24% of them have lost their jobs. When you're making between $30,000 to $85,000, 4% lost their jobs. And when you're making greater than 85,000, they had an increase of 1%. And so one of the things that we're seeing is that the pandemic is focusing, as all of you have pointed out, on the inequities and the disparities that existed before. But at the same time, many of these jobs may be permanently lost. And so how do we create, you know, the kind of job that people are talking about, where they can get a decent wage and respect from that job, Or is there some other way that we really have to address income disparity in this country?
Ron, I think the thing is, it's never a one answer, right? And I think what the conversation, which has been very rich, kind of surfaces, is there are actually multiple ideas, and we have I forgot exactly the year, in the 60s under Johnson, there was a 2-year period where I think more than 200 pieces of legislation, significant legislation on the war on poverty, were passed. It was a huge number. And I think that we have made some discursive advances, right? We're talking about things in the public sphere differently. Obama in 2008 was the first president to call healthcare a human right in the presidential debates. Biden was the first one to name systemic racism. This is not about those particular men, right? This is about our making advances in the discursive realm. And I think we need to, as someone mentioned narrative earlier, I think we need to really seize that narrative and not be asking questions about, is it this or is it that, but what is everything we need? And with the kind of big push that we need it now, we need a federal jobs guarantee. Derek Hamilton's plan was something that the civil rights movement asked for. It's a good plan. The numbers have been crunched, and we need to invest in worker co-ops. You know, Northern Italy, 2/3 of people are involved in one kind of co-op or another. A co-op economy we know is possible. We shouldn't feel like we are in an either or. And we need to make housing a public good, because housing drives poverty. And we need to think about, and I think this is a much more complicated conversation, what is a universal basic income that's actually equitable, and not what the tech firms are putting out there as something just to keep people hanging on. I've talked to heterodox economists who said, well, why not make the earned income tax credit much, much bigger? So it's actually totally equitable, and the tax system is universal and everyone participates in it. There's a million ideas out there. There shouldn't be one. We deserve hundreds. We have had hundreds of abusive and harmful policies and programs, thousands possibly if you count them all, since this neoliberal project has begun. We should ask for them all. And if we get them all, we'll be fine. And let's start with public banks, Sarah. I think it's an excellent idea.
Given the propensity of federal legislators, this is a question from the chat, so I'm reading it. Given the propensity of federal legislators and executives to follow corporate interests and policy, what are some of the tools or examples of applications of tools at our disposal to change the narrative and build a groundswell of public support for these system changes? Anybody want to tackle that one?
Well, I don't want to be the only one talking, but I don't think the tools are any different.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, what Stacey did in Georgia, those are the tools. What people do organizing, those are the tools. We know the tools, just like the ideas aren't new. We know what the tools are. We need to take power in every sphere and not be afraid of power, right? Sometimes we are afraid of governing power. Sometimes we're afraid of economic power. We have an uncomfortable relationship with it. I think we have to step into taking that power in across the board. We need inside power. We need to take over institutions. We need outside power. We need to build community, dissent. We need to take over the media. We need to grow it. Nothing is new. It's about everyone, in a sense, doubling down and throwing down, because the opposition is wealthy, vicious, and has doesn't have a problem taking the gloves off.
Can't agree more with what Kathy was just saying. And, we've referenced Stacey Abrams a couple times in this evening's conversation, and taking nothing from her. I'm from Georgia, and I'm still riding the high of the Senate election. So I'm on board, but just remembering that there's a Stacey Abrams in every state, in every city, in every community, and we're just not funding their work, or not funding it at the level it needs to be funded. So like they're out there, these people are doing the work, and how do we better support that work? How do we join them? How do we follow them? I think is really important too. We've referenced worker co-ops a couple times. That's something that FPWA has been involved in at the New York City level as well. Something we're very, very proud of. And, Sarah mentioned that one of the biggest pushbacks is scalability. And I would say, like, we can't limit ourselves to ideas that can only be scaled for every city and every state, that we have to allow ourselves to have local solution and community level solutions as well. And worker co-ops really do fit into that in a really beautiful way. And so that was something that always kind of like irked us when someone pushed back about the scalability. It was like, who cares? Who cares? As long as the community is taking care of itself and we're able to provide for themselves, we should be leaning into these solutions there. And as was said, it's going to take 100 solutions of varying sizes and scalability, and that shouldn't scare us away.
One of my colleagues, Isa Yonder, wrote, "I feel there's an elephant in the room. One reason that the care economy jobs are not taken seriously in talking about recovery and in generally underpaid or unpaid is because there are jobs related to women's unpaid gender roles." And I see Kathy responded. I'm just wondering if there are others that have a response. How do we really deal with the issues of gender as well as race and other issues that come to play here? It's made everybody speechless. Roland, since you're the only male on the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. I think you deal with race and gender much the same way as the previous question of organizing. We got the women's movement in this country because of folks organizing over time. The same with community reinvestment and Gail Sincata. So to deal with intersectionality means acquiring power through organizing in those communities that are impacted.
How many people here know who Gail Sincata was? Do you want to take a crack at it, describing her role, Roland, or?
Well, Gail Sincata was an activist, started out as a mom in Chicago, I believe, and saw that her community was being redlined. And with other agents in the community, including the faith community, went out on the stump and said, this is wrong. Eventually it got made its way to the federal level. And I believe in 1979, the Community Investment Act was first passed. Sarah, I see you may have different information, but I think it was 1979. And although it's been reauthorized and changed over the years, it's still a hallmark of what can be done, so much so that the banks at one point said, we like the Community Reinvestment Act because it has taught us how to work in markets that we otherwise would not know how to work in. And some of them were distressed that it's weakening, others were not, let me be clear. But the fact is, it changed the relationship to capital in this country for poor communities and opened its way for the CDFI legislation. It just opened the door for a lot of stuff that helped to green marginalized communities. Not enough, but some.
I was fortunate to know Gail, and Gail was a activist in the school system in Chicago. I believe it was in the Austin neighborhood, white working class neighborhood, undergoing a lot of racial change and transition. And she was trying to fight for better schools and to make sure that some of her neighbors could refinance their houses or get home improvement loans, and they couldn't. So what she did is she organized her neighbors to go to the local bank. And when they went to that bank, they were arrested for trespassing. And she didn't take that sitting down. What she did is she organized all of her followers, and they were close to 100 or more, to go into the bank and open bank accounts at $1 deposit each. And they tied up the bank operation for days until they finally negotiated a settlement with her. That action was replicated in communities around the country. And after a while, she basically raised the issue of redlining got passed because one of the senators, a Republican senator, I believe, from Senator Proxmire, introduced a bill called HMDA, H-M-D-A, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which then gave community the ability to know where they got the deposits and where they spent their deposits. With that information, and we did some of that research with groups in Williamsburg and in Bedford-Stuyvesant at that time. With that information, eventually the Community Reinvestment Act came about. That Community Reinvestment Act poured a lot of money into low and moderate income communities. The problem is that it's not been defined to benefit the people who live there, but the land that's there. So now it's what originally was used in a strong way to benefit the quality of the neighborhood has been distorted to basically lead towards the gentrification of those neighborhoods, rather than say, how do we target that money to the beneficiaries being the people who live there?
Could I add something to that, Ron?
Sure, please.
I mean, our work was very much centered for many years on supporting grassroots groups in the city that wanted to use the Community Reinvestment Act to get banks to the table when they wouldn't otherwise negotiate or support, do loans or services or investments in neighborhoods. And so, I mean, there's something else about that law, which is Gail Sincata and the people that she worked with to get the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act enacted and the Community Reinvestment Act, which followed a couple years later, were very much talking, I mean, she was a white woman, but they were very much talking about race. It was against the backdrop of race, and it was very much understood. But the statute doesn't mention race. It talks about income. And it's basically says banks have an affirmative obligation to serve all communities equitably, including low and moderate income neighborhoods. And so the regulators and the banks have used this for years to say, this isn't about race. You can't use this around redlining. This is about income. And it's really been, terrible. And the people who worked with her, who are still alive, have talked, pointed to the legislative history. Of course it's about race. What are you talking about? But I would say that as banks have become so big and so powerful, and the national banks so dominating the sphere, I think the 3, maybe 80% of the deposits in New York are held by the 4 largest banks in the country. So there's just also been this incredible consolidation and wielding of political as well as economic power. It hasn't been the same sort of leveraging mechanism that groups used for many years. But I would say something even more about something like that, which is, yes, because of this law, billions of dollars made their way into low and moderate income communities around the country. It's also kind of what I was talking about before, is that it's a way that we can rationalize the system. We say, well, we use the laws and we got the banks to the table and we said they have to comply with this law, but the law doesn't have any actual requirements. It just says they have a continuing and affirmative obligation to make best efforts to meet community credit needs. And there's really no consequence if they don't. So, that's the thinking and the work that made a lot of sense. And she was an amazing, amazing person and activist and brought a lot of good to the world through her work. But we're in a point now where it seems really clear that we can't just be sort of like getting banks to the table or sort of using these laws don't work anymore at all, really, in a lot of ways, to actually have any kind of power. So we need to, that's one reason we're thinking about public banking. It's another reason where we're concerned that doing that kind of stuff keeps us in this groove that maybe made sense at a different point in time, but now doesn't really help us build power and achieve power and assert power in ways that are going to take us closer to this world we're trying to create, because it's basically like get banks to be accountable. I'm not really sure what that means.
Well, I think I should point out that, and I think Roland began touching on this in his comments, is that Gail was, in his opening comments, Gail was trained. She was trained by Saul Alinsky.
Yep.
And so her efforts at working with communities came about because there were institutes that were working on training people to be organizers. And one of the things that a number of years ago, there was a great guy who was very much involved in housing in New York City by the name of Bob Schur. He died too many years ago and died too young. But Bob wrote a piece in City Limits called Back to Basics. And in it, he basically argued that one of the problems with community development corporations and a lot of community-based groups is they begin to get involved in the delivery of services. So they're afraid to be out there shouting and organizing for change. And how do we work that formula? How do we make sure that those housing groups in New York City, or even some of the environmental justice groups who may be entering into contracts with the city to carry out certain services, how do we make sure that they keep the organizing and the challenging of local government at the fore rather than stepping back because they're afraid of losing some of their funding? I think this is an issue we as a movement really have to address.
Well, I think if I may respond to that a little bit, I think we have focused over the years, and you know, every generation has people that do amazing things. So it's not, it's you're right, Sarah, like it, but that doesn't mean we don't have to keep pushing, right, and keep moving and adapting to our context. But I think we have, in my lifetime, in our field, in our work, in our movements, we have focused a lot on getting institutional resources without thinking about how to take institutional power. So once we kind of grab some of those resources, but we haven't amassed actual power over those institutions, and not just outside power, which requires constant pressure, but inside power. Like, why should those institutions be run by anyone else but our communities? You know, I think we need to figure out how to expand our notion of the kind of power we want to take. Right. And once you do get funding or you do get resources and you don't have power that comes with it within that institution, you are in a delicate situation. Right. I think you will always need to have people who are completely doing the outside game. But we also need people that are willing to take power from the inside. And that is something I've only come to believe in the last couple of years after seeing, you know, gains we make, and then we backtrack and we have to grab them again. We have to re-campaign or relitigate. Like, there's got to be something that makes it sustainable. And on some level, that's got to be some permanent realignment of relationships that change power relationships.
You know, Ron, it's complicated because you look at older
I think you're frozen.
cities have Africans or.
Roland, can you repeat what you said? I think you were frozen for a minute.
I think the issue of taking power and also steering the benefits of power to communities, it's a complicated issue because if you look at legacy cities, many of these legacy cities are Black and brown and have power structures that are Black and brown. But the problem is they're afraid to give back power to the communities that from which they sprang because they're afraid of being organized or out-organized. So the question becomes, even if we have power at points, does that guarantee that we will now transfer that power to the community?
So this is where I'm been trying to work with people who are thinking about new models of power sharing, right? Because having individuals from our communities in an institution is not the same thing as having our communities have power over that institution, right? And I think in part, it cannot just be representation. We know that always falls short. So how do we actually think about how our communities can govern institutions in a more collective way is, I think, the thing we need to wrestle with a little bit more.
I agree.
I think there's agreement there.
And I'm not trying to put Kathy on the spot, but I'd really like to hear some of the models, maybe others. Maybe it's the work of collaboratives, the cooperatives, But I'd love to hear some of the alternative structures that we could perhaps put in place. And
So, I mean, I think that, for example, that's one of the reasons I raised the community land trust, perhaps publicly financed. In that case, the community literally governs the neighborhood, right? It has a certain amount of power over the neighborhood. Many people are familiar with the Dudley Street success, which has been sustained, right? They have power over their space and place. There are people that are engaging in pushing, and in the US, it's not as developed as it has been elsewhere, but participatory budgeting doesn't have to be budgeting that's just for like extra money, the way we do it in New York. Around the world, they've actually had community participatory budgeting to determine an entire budget of an area, right, of a region. So that's another kind of like, how do we build that democratic practice where we actually, and it does require supporting leadership development, right, and supporting people to engage. I think, Ron, when you say you were talking about people being trained, it's really important that people be trained in whatever way we're going to deploy them. We can't, wealthy people, elite people are trained all the time to govern, to exercise power. And we need to do more of that training for communities that have fewer resources. But yes, there's participatory budgeting in schools. There's schools that have adopted a truly sort of comprehensive restorative justice model. And that is actually a co-governance model between students, teachers, and parents that set the norms and the expectations and realign relationships in schools. Like, what if that were more of the norm? We already know how much influence wealthier parents have in schools. How do we build more formal structures to empower parents who are not as wealthy in schools, right? Who can barely get past the metal detector. So there are models that need to be built and deepened. There are things that we can take from other places. But the bottom line is we have to, I think, rethink democracy in a much more participatory way, because we have a very thin notion of what it is. And when you peel it back, it's clearly not particularly robust.
agreed.
We're quickly coming up to 7:30. And I do want to raise one concern I have, and this may be the unintended consequence of some of the things we're discussing. What if we give communities power, and those same communities turn out to be predominantly white and predominantly wealthy communities, and they use that power for exclusion or for diversion of resources from areas that really need it? How do we develop a sort of a check and balance that we can empower communities, but also develop a set of principles that govern their actions? And I want to, open that up to all of you to please respond. Let's start with Emily.
I should not be the first person you come to for this question. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I will say that I do tend to be a bit of a Pollyanna when it comes to some of these things, in that I do trust that when you do, that communities ultimately make the best decisions for themselves. But there are definitely those in which there has to be some sort of governing structure. And, just like any sort of coalition or work that you do for collective action, having a governance structure and making sure that there's a system of accountability, I think, is really important. But I am not the expert on this, so I'm going to turn it over to someone else who is.
All right, Sarah?
I'm going to ask you to clarify your question. Are you thinking about sort of like the early days of participatory budgeting, when the people who stepped up tended to be the gentrifiers or white people in neighborhoods, and there had to be a lot of organizing to make sure that, is that what you're thinking of?
That's part of what I'm thinking of. The other is I'm thinking about some of the zoning actions that are occurring in the city, where they're all targeted to our low-income neighborhoods where people are being displaced. I'm thinking about the location of housing for homeless families or burdensome uses, the fight that Eddie Batista was in for a number of years, because there was there was a refusal for many communities in New York to carry their fair share of burdensome uses around the location of garbage transfer stations. And they spent money using their hiring lawyers and fighting what was a progressive attempt. And I'm a strong believer in community-based development. I'm a strong believer in everything that's been talked about here. But I also believe that we have to have certain principles that guide the decisions.
So,
I mean, isn't that what just transition is all about? Sorry, go ahead, Kathy.
oh no, go ahead, Sarah.
I was going to say, I mean, isn't that, as we're transforming our economy and our systems, that, we need to center concepts of just transition so that the people who already have borne the brunt of these inequalities and the pandemic and racial violence and injustice, and the list goes on, and the, gender issues that somebody raised that none of us really talked about. I think that, while that's happening, you don't want those people also to bear the brunt of the change that's taking place, so I think the concepts of just transition have to be really explicit, and racial and gender justice have to be really explicit. And it's a little bit what Emily was saying about the individual institutions certainly should enshrine these, governance principles, and making sure there's also, that's what an equity agenda is about, which is that you really focus the resources on people who have been most oppressed, and where the needs are greatest. And then rather than you don't just do a kind of blanket, okay, everybody is, we're going to pretend everybody's equal and we're going to create equal power opportunity here, that we as a collective see a responsibility to one another, and that we put our energy into that, and that's going to benefit everybody as well. So, I mean, those are sort of conceptual responses to what you're saying, although I think your question is a real one. But I mean, I'm not sure what it means to give people who already have power. So I guess I don't really understand your question, but.
I actually do understand your question. And I think it is a huge danger of like a serious challenge, because whatever we put in place, we're putting in place in the wake of a highly, racialized and gendered history for the country. And you don't unpackage that in a moment. So yeah, I can imagine if we start building community models that white supremacists are communities too, and they're going to participate in those models. So I worked with someone who called it the challenge of reconciling the normative with the participatory, right? I mean, that doesn't mean we can just hand it over to noblesse oblige and give the elites yet another chance. That hasn't worked out that well. But I do think we do need sort of clear, not just the idea of equity, but institutionalizing. We need to institutionalize equity as a North Star and as a kind of operating principle in the way that we do business socially, economically, and politically. And that is a big piece of work. It's not an overnight piece of work. But if we don't embed the norms you refer to, Ron, into the institutions that we want to make more democratic, absolutely. It's just going to replicate, if not worsen, what we already have. So I do think that the idea of sort of universal broad democracy has to be paired in a strategic operational way with deep equity strategies. And we need to be able to name them. We need to be able to name race, name gender, because you can't change what you can't name. And they have to be like legal policy targets with real enforceable and operational approaches that can be held to account. And that's not a simple thing, but we don't have a simple problem to solve.
I know that's hard to follow, but I want to ask the other panelists if you have any last words you want to say before I turn it over to Eddie, who I'm asking to talk a little bit about just transition, since he's our point man when it comes to just transitions. So Sarah, Roland, Emily. Sarah, do you have any last word?
Yeah, I mean, I did understand your question before. I was trying to give you a hard time. It's hard in a Zoom to convey. Yeah. And I think it is, there's a lot that we're facing. And in a way, the pandemic is the looming environmental cataclysm that's around the corner. I mean, there are things we can talk about and project. We're going to have no choices, the luxury of some of this. And I think that the more that we institutionalize, as Kathy was saying, and anticipate and really try to live these principles and embed them in our institutions, I mean, that's the only shot we have. Otherwise, it's a bleak picture. And, I stay very energetic, and we have a lot of work to do, and we gotta keep going. But I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these ideas with you all. But, let's be real. Things are not gonna just get better. And there's a lot of other challenges that we can't, a year ago, did we know that this was gonna look the way it did, the pandemic? No. Maybe we could have kind of thought at some point there'd be some, like I said, this is like a dry run for the environmental issues that many parts of the world already face, that we're going to all be facing together very soon.
I agree. Who's left? Roland and Emily?
Well, I just appreciate the opportunity to sit on the panel and hear some great thinking. I think that the issues are very difficult, thorny, and the ability to sort of work through them is what democracy is all about. So I just appreciate the opportunity, Ron.
Same. Thank you so much for having me join this panel. I've learned a lot in doing this. I'm going to be following up with Sarah about this public bank campaign and whether FPWA can sign on to that. So I'm excited about ways that we can collaborate. And what I thought was interesting about this panel was that we all, I think, had the same core vision that was driving it, but we're all coming about it in a little bit of a different way. And I think that is actually indicative of how we have to approach this problem as a whole, as been said before. So huge problems, as Sarah mentioned, but leaving feeling a little bit more hopeful about some of the possible solutions we can fight towards together.
Yeah. I guess, is that everybody? I guess so. Eddie, it's your ballpark.
So I'm the one standing between everybody else and their glasses of wine that Pratt will be furnishing for the next series. Is that right, Ron? No, is that?
We'll make up for it next year.
This is true. This is true. I want to thank all the panelists. Really, it was really a treat to hear kind of like the energy and the experience and the vision that you guys brought tonight. When we first started organizing this series, when you talk about an equitable recovery for New York, Ron, with the minute he said that, I was like, exactly. Like, this was the panel that we needed to set the foundation for this series and to help begin contextualizing it. And I just want to remind folks, and thank you, Sarah, for name checking Just Transitions. That will be throughout the next panel that we have. The next one is scheduled for March 19th. That one is going to be, that one's called The Intersection of Climate Justice and Economic Justice. We're going to have a powerhouse lineup of folks talking about just transitions and the rest of it. And what's interesting is that also the timing of this, I was really looking forward to this series. Not that I don't look forward to it every year and to hear about stock transfer tax. By the way, Ron, stock transfer tax, State Senator James Sanders is moving a bill. It might happen. So just keep your fingers crossed.
We should all keep our fingers crossed.
Exactly. And so, but one of the reasons I was really kind of excited about this series now is not just kind of like the national exorcism that we just went through, right? Which is, it was stunning. I didn't hear the word Biden administration once tonight. I was bracing myself. But we also have again a completely new New York City mayoral election in front of us, right? We've got ranked choice voting. We've got because life wasn't complicated enough, right? And to have these conversations at this pivotal moment, not just for the country, but for our beloved city, it's a privilege to share this with you all. Again, I guess my last parting words is, we keep talking about the light at the end of the tunnel, and people were waiting for this moment. And I keep having to remind folks that what's that old saying? The light at the end of the tunnel is not the illusion. The tunnel is the illusion. I'm not sure what that means, but I just wanted to leave you guys with that. I wanted to try to sound deep on a Friday night. Bless you all. Thank you all. And we will see you on March 19th.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. And remember, there's one thing I want to say, and that is that doing this with Eddie has always been a pleasure. I also want to thank my host institution, Pratt, and the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment and underwriting this, because most universities don't engage either their students or the community in a coordinated way to address substantive issues and particularly important issues. So thank you all for coming and joining us.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches. Okay. Thank you, Roland. Delaney and Amron?
Yes, I think we need to stop the YouTube stream.